The mud tasted of copper and rot, filling Elias Thorne's mouth as he pressed his face into the forest floor. 3 inches above his head, a jet of green light shattered the bark of an ancient oak, showering him with burning splinters. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. If he moved even a fraction of an inch, the movement would give him away to the 3 figures stalking through the mist less than 20 yards away. They were masked, silent, and moving in a triangular formation. A standard sweep and clear tactic used by Death Eaters during the First War to flush out runaways. But tonight, they weren't hunting runaways. They were hunting students. Elias counted the heartbeats thudding in his ears. 1, 2, 3. His right hand was buried deep in the leaf litter, gripping the handle of a wand that looked less like a magical instrument and more like a piece of driftwood dragged out of a swamp. It was thick, knotted, and slightly curved, with a rough surface that had given him blisters during his first year. Firewood, the Ravenclaws called it. The twig, the Slytherins sneered. Even Professor Flitwick had once gently suggested that perhaps the wand's temperament was too rustic for the delicate wrist movements of charms work. But right now, that rustic temperament was the only thing keeping Elias alive. He could feel the vibration of the approaching footsteps through the wood of the wand. It was humming, a low, angry resonance that traveled from the damp earth, through the gnarled handle, and into his arm. The Death Eaters were closing the net. They had shields raised, standard Protego charms that shimmered with blue light, perfect for deflecting stunning spells or hexes. But Elias had no intention of casting a hex. He had 3 enemies, no backup, and a wand that couldn't cast a straight stunning spell to save his life. He closed his eyes and twisted his wrist, not in the sharp, elegant flick of a duelist, but in a grinding, heavy motion, like turning a rusted key in a lock. He didn't aim at the Death Eaters. He aimed at the ground. "Come out, little mudblood," one of the masks called out, his voice bored. "We know you're bleeding." Elias whispered a spell that wasn't in the standard curriculum. It was something he'd found in a gardening manual from the 1800s, intended for uprooting stubborn stumps. The ground beneath the lead Death Eater didn't explode. It liquefied. The solid earth turned into a hungry, churning slurry of mud and roots. The wizard's foot sank, his balance broke, and his Protego shield faltered for a split second as he flailed. In that microsecond of distraction, Elias didn't fire a spell. He yanked his wand upward. A wrist-thick root, dormant for decades, whipped out of the slurry and snapped around the Death Eater's ankle, dragging him face first into the muck with a wet crunch. 1 down, 2 to go. And he had maybe 40 seconds before they realized that the forest itself was fighting back. If you want to know how this forgotten wizard turned a piece of firewood and a gardening manual into Hogwarts' last line of defense, stay with me until the end of this story. To understand why Elias Thorne was alone in the Forbidden Forest in November of 1979, you have to understand the hierarchy of Hogwarts during the war. There were the heroes, the potters, the blacks, the prefects with their polished mahogany wands and perfect posture. And then there was Elias. He was a half-blood from a family of hedge witches who barely scraped by selling herbs. He couldn't afford a wand from Ollivander's. Instead, he'd bought his from a barrel in a dusty antique shop in Knockturn Alley for 2 galleons. It had no known core, no maker's mark, and it resisted every attempt at refinement. In Transfiguration, his teacups grew moss instead of turning into tortoises. In defense against the dark arts, his shield charms were heavy and opaque, like stone walls rather than shimmering barriers, blocking his own vision as much as the enemy's. Clumsy magic, they called it, peasant magic. By his 5th year, Elias had stopped trying to duel like the others. He spent his free periods in the greenhouses or the edge of the forest, the only places where his wand didn't feel like it was fighting him. He realized that while his wand struggled with the airy, mathematical precision of Latinate spellwork, it sang when it touched organic matter. It didn't want to float feathers, it wanted to break rocks. The crisis began on a Tuesday. A cell of 7 Death Eaters had breached the perimeter wards, not to attack the castle directly, but to camp in the Forbidden Forest and pick off students serving detention or gathering ingredients. The ministry was stretched thin. Auras were days away. The headmaster was absent on urgent business. The defense of the grounds fell to the senior students and the remaining staff. The dueling club champions, the best of Gryffindor and Ravenclaw, had gone out on the first night. They came back on stretchers. Their precise, laser-focused spells were useless in the dense fog. The Death Eaters used the trees for cover, and the damp air diffused the standard stunning spells. The champions were used to dueling on flat wooden stages with clear lines of sight. They weren't ready for a war where the enemy could merge with the shadows. That was when Elias, quietly polishing his shoes in the Hufflepuff common room, stood up. He knew the forest. He knew the paths where the mud was deep and the hollows where the fog gathered. And he knew that in the dark, a straight line was a liability. He went out alone on the second night. He didn't take a broom. He walked. Now, crouching behind the oak tree, the adrenaline was starting to curdle into cold fear. The first Death Eater was still struggling in the mud, choking on the slurry. But the other 2 had learned. They backed up, back to back, one snapping back and forth. "Show yourself!" the taller one screamed, firing a blasting curse into the brush. A sapling disintegrated into ash and sparks. Elias pressed his hand against the rough bark of the oak. He could feel the sap running through the tree, slow and cold. His wand was vibrating so hard his teeth rattled. He had a theory, a stupid, suicidal theory, that he could channel a Diffindo severing charm not through the air, but through the wood itself. If he was wrong, the backlash would shatter his wand and probably blow his hand off. He took a breath that smelled of ozone and wet leaves. He visualized the network of branches above the Death Eaters. He didn't cast the spell at them. He stabbed the tip of his wand directly into the trunk of the oak tree he was hiding behind. "Diffindo!" he grunted. pouring every ounce of his magical core into the wood. The magic didn't flash, it traveled. A split second later, 20 feet above the Death Eaters, a massive, waterlogged branch the size of a carriage sheared off the trunk with the sound of a cannon shot. It didn't fall randomly, because Elias had channeled the cut through the tree's own structure. The branch swung down like a pendulum, guided by the remaining fibers of bark. The Death Eaters looked up too late. The heavy wood crashed through their shields, smashing them into the ground. One was pinned instantly. The other rolled away, mask cracked, wand flying into the darkness. Elias scrambled from his cover, his legs shaking. He didn't run. He moved low, sliding through the fern, keeping his wand close to the earth. He had to secure them before they recovered. He used the Firewood wand to weave the tall grass around their wrists, the stalks becoming as tough as wire under his influence. But he made a mistake. In his rush to bind the second Death Eater, he stepped on a dry twig. The snap was like a gunshot in the quiet clearing. The third Death Eater, the one who had rolled away, wasn't unconscious. He was feigning it. As Elias leaned over, the dark wizard whipped a dagger from his boot. It wasn't a spell, it was cold steel. Elias threw himself backward, but the blade sliced across his forearm, opening a gash from elbow to wrist. Pain, hot and white, blinded him. He fell back into the mud, his wand slipping from his blood-slicked fingers. The Death Eater loomed over him, face revealed. A young man, scarred and terrified, eyes manic with the need to kill. "You filthy little gardener," the man spat, raising the dagger for a killing stroke. "You think twigs can stop the Dark Lord?" Elias scrambled backward, his hand grasping for his wand. It was 3 feet away, too far. The Death Eater lunged. If this forgotten legend of Hogwarts is already touching your heart, and you'd like to help keep these stories alive, you can support the channel by clicking the thanks button below the video. Every little bit helps me continue bringing you more hidden tales of courage and magic. Elias stared at the descending blade. He didn't try to reach the wand with his hand. He reached with his mind. He remembered the mockery, the way the wand refused to perform simple Accio spells in class. It never came when called. It was stubborn. It was rooted. "Don't come to me," he thought, staring at the ugly stick of wood. "Grow." He poured his desperation into the connection he'd built over 5 years of lonely practice. He didn't cast a spell on the wand. He fed the wand his magic from a distance, treating it like a planted seed. The Firewood wand didn't fly to his hand. Instead, it sprouted instantly. In the time it took the dagger to fall, the rough wood of the wand exploded into a thicket of brambles. It wasn't a gentle growth, it was a violent, rapid expansion of thorny blackthorn vines that erupted from the wand lying in the mud. The vines didn't just grow, they lashed out, seeking heat. The Death Eater screamed as a vine thick as a python wrapped around his torso, the inch-long thorns piercing his robes. The dagger clattered onto a stone.
The brambles continued to expand, creating a wall of thorns between the killer and the student, then tightening until the man was cocooned, immobile, against the trunk of a pine tree. Elias lay panting in the mud, clutching his bleeding arm. The forest was silent again, save for the whimpering of the trapped men. He looked at his wand. It was buried somewhere in the center of that thorny mass, doing exactly what it was made to do. It wasn't a dueling wand, it was a war wand. It was a piece of the wild, refusing to be tamed. He spent the next hour dismantling the trap, vine by vine, forcing his wand to retract its growth. It was exhausting work, harder than any duel. By the time he had the 3 men bound and floating, awkwardly bumping into trees behind him, the sun was beginning to bleed grey light through the canopy. The walk back to the castle was a blurred nightmare of pain and exhaustion. He had captured 4 others over the previous 2 nights using fog-summoning charms and pit traps, but this had been the cell leader. When he emerged from the tree line, the sight that greeted him was surreal. A group of students and professors were gathered near Hagrid's hut, looking anxious. Professor McGonagall was there, her face pale. The elite duelists were there, nursing their bandaged limbs. They went silent as Elias Thorne, the boy with the Firewood wand, stumbled onto the lawn. He looked like a swamp creature, covered in mud, blood, and moss. Behind him, floating in a tangled, chaotic knot of roots and vines,
were 3 unconscious Death Eaters. He didn't say a word. He simply let the levitation charm drop. The bodies hit the brass with a heavy thud. Elias looked at the group. His eyes found the Ravenclaw prefect who had laughed at his wand a week ago. He raised the gnarly, ugly, knotted stick. It was still smoking slightly, wisps of steam rising from the wood. It looked dangerous now. It looked like a weapon forged by the earth itself. "They struggle with the roots," Elias said hoarsely. "Don't use lights, use the ground." Then his knees buckled and the world went black. He woke up in the hospital wing 2 days later. There was no grand ceremony. There was no House Cup victory announcement. The ministry hushed up the incident, claiming the Death Eaters had been apprehended by a special task force to avoid panic. But the story survived in whispers. Elias found his wand on the bedside table. Someone had cleaned it. It still looked like firewood, ugly, bent, and rough. But when he picked it up, he felt a warmth in the handle that hadn't been there before. Acknowledgement. Professor Flitwick visited him later that afternoon. The tiny professor looked at the wand, then at Elias. "I admit," Flitwick squeaked softly, "that I may have misjudged the alignment of your instrument, Mr. Thorne. It seems it is not stubborn, it is simply selective." Elias didn't become a famous Auror. He didn't lead armies. After graduation, he disappeared into the quiet life of a herbologist, supplying rare potion ingredients to St. Mungo's. But for the rest of his time at Hogwarts, whenever the heavy rains turned the grounds to mud and the fog rolled in from the forest, the bullies left him alone.
They looked at the Firewood wand and didn't see a joke anymore. They saw the thing that had dragged 7 killers into the dark and swallowed them whole. It reminds us that power in the wizarding world isn't always about the cleanest pronunciation or the most expensive wood. Sometimes the magic you need is dirty, heavy, and hiding in the things everyone else threw away. It teaches us that when the world tells you your tools are broken, maybe you're just using them in the wrong fight. If this forgotten legend of Hogwarts touched your heart, tell me in the comments. What would you have done in Elias's place? Would you have run, or would you have turned the forest into a weapon? Like the video, share it with another Harry Potter fan, and subscribe to hear more hidden stories of courage, magic, and impossible odds. Sometimes the ugliest wand casts the strongest shadow.